Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Riccardo and I work at the University of Melbourne. I'm a PhD candidate. Today I'm going to talk about the visibility of Italianness in Melbourne and how this visibility influences university learners' motivations to study the language. So I'll first start by talking about the Italian presence in Victoria and in Melbourne, and then I'm going to discuss how the influence of local communities in Melbourne, as I was saying, influences learners' motivation by presenting preliminary data from my study. And I'll finish off by presenting some pedagogical implications. So first of all, I would like to present some statistics. So as you can see, there is a significant presence of Italians in Australia. Cristiana Palmieri was talked about it before, and we know that considering the residents, if we focus on Victoria specifically, 6% of the residents in Victoria report having Italian origins, according to the 2016 census. And the majority of them live in Melbourne, reside in Melbourne, and make up 6.7% of the residents in the city. And the 2016 census also reveals that 1.4% of residents in Melbourne were born in Italy. So we can already see that there is a significant presence of Italians in the city. Another study that, again, was mentioned today is the study conducted by Armilei and Mascitelli, and this study reveals the presence of a new wave of Italians. So again, as we said before, these Italians are normally mainly come to Australia on a temporary visa, and as you can see, in terms of the working holiday visa applications, Italians are the 6th most numerous groups. So there is a significant increase in the numbers of Italians that come to Australia, and as Armilleri and Mascitelli say, and I'm quoting, they say, this new wave of migration, even though often temporary, has added a new stream to an Italian community mainly characterized by the descendants of the earlier post-war migrants. So again, this points to the fact that the Italian community is even more visible. We have the community of the post-war migrants and new migrants as well. So if we focus on Melbourne in particular, needless to say, we know that the representation of Italian culture is embodied by Lycon Street through cultural and festive events, through architectural features such as Piazza Italia, through the use of the Italian language, and most importantly through Italian food, the Lygon Street projects an Italianness, so provides a vivid representation of Italian culture in Melbourne. And food in particular is a significant element in projecting this identity, not only because food is a collection of products that can be used for statistical and nutritional studies, but because it is a system of communication, a body of images, a protocol of usages, situations, and behaviors. This is particularly important for a culture like Italian culture that is widely recognized overseas for its gastronomical and enological diversity. So the fact of being exposed to Italian food obviously creates context and connections to Italian culture. So if we think about the identity that is projected by Lygon Street as the identity projected by many little Italies all over the world, we know that this identity can be described as ambiguous in many ways. It's what Amada calls an exotic otherness. So it's an exotic otherness because it presents elements that are foreign, and so, for example, some iconic elements that associate with Italian culture, so a culture which is in many ways foreign to Australia, even though we know that Italian culture is also part of Australia in certain ways. But it's also familiar, so the identity that is projected in Lygon Street is also in line with the expectations of an Australian clientele. And I'm going to provide some evidence for this by looking at food. As you can see, the Italian strip presents many elements, many iconic elements that sort of that are used by restaurants in the area and by shops in the area to sort of claim their authenticity. And by doing so, they are reassuring their consumers that what they are offering is actually authentic. And so by doing so, they present typical elements, typical tropes of Italian culture. Another important element that serves again to create this sense of authenticity and appropriation of Italian culture is the use of the language. And there is a wonderful app called Linguasnap in Melbourne. It's an app that was developed by the University of Manchester to create a linguistic mapping of multilingual cities. And we also have this map this app has also been used in Australia thanks to a collaboration between the University of Manchester and the University of Melbourne. What people can do with this app, users can take pictures of, for example, leaflets or signs where a certain language is used. So if we enter the language Italian, we can see that what the users have uploaded, as you can see, the majority of symbols of Italianness where the language is used are actually along Lygon Street. So again, the Italian strip claims its Italianness also by the use of the Italian language. Again, as I was saying, it is not only the Italian strip, but it's also the Italo-Australian strips. Again, we can look at the ambiguous identity projected by Lygon Street from many different aspects, and if we focus, for example, on the food aspect, we can see that the restaurants in the area also present elements that are not authentically Italian. For example, they offer chicken parma or pasta with chicken and so on. So the idea is that they are trying to project an identity that is also in line with the expectations of the clientele that they are trying to target. So we might say that even the Italians that is projected in the area makes more sense to Australians. So it can even be more appealing since it blends together these different elements. Okay, so now I'm going to present some preliminary data on the motivations of learners of Italian. The question, one of the research questions that I'm trying to answer here is, does the presence of Italian in Melbourne influence learners' motivations? And again, as Palmieri mentioned before, she conducted a similar study in Sydney. And so I wanted to see if the same similar results can also be applicable in Melbourne. And what I did, as part of my PhD project, I used a survey. In my PhD project, I looked at data from different learner populations in different contexts, and one of the contexts was Melbourne. And I used a survey on 74 students of Italian, but in my study I focused on university students of Italian, and this survey elicited both quantitative and qualitative data, and this survey was also complemented by longitudinal interviews on 5 learners, and also 2 diary entries that students had to fill in. So I'll present just preliminary results from this. But before I present the results, I wanted to just briefly focus on a key construct at the basis of my study, which is integrativeness. So integrativeness is a motivational construct that was developed by Gardner. It was developed in the Canadian context. As you know, the Canadian context is characterized by the presence of different communities, Anglo and English-speaking communities and French-speaking communities. So what Gardner hypothesized was that the member of one community might be interested to learn the language of the other community to come closer to that community. So Gardner says that integrativeness is a genuine interest in learning the second language in order to come closer to the other language community. And more recently, Dernier has criticized this construct and has expanded this construct to account also for the motivations of learners of languages that are not necessarily associated with specific communities, for example, English. So integrativeness, according to Dernier, is redefined as an internal process of identification with a person's self-concept, rather than identification with an external reference group. So when people learn a language, they want to come closer to a sort of an ideal, desired identity as of themselves as speakers of that language. So in my study, I consider integrativeness as a way to, and I'm going to elaborate that when I discuss the findings, that integrativeness appears both as a desire to come closer to an Italian-speaking community, so to the Italian community in Italy, so in the L2 country, but also to the local community in Australia due to the presence of the language in the streets, and the presence of the language in the city. So some data from statistical data from the questionnaires, students had to answer whether learning Italian allowed them to interact with Italian speakers in Melbourne, again, in acknowledgement of the presence of Italian in Melbourne. And as you can see, the vast majority of students answered that strongly agreed with the statement, and a considerable number agreed with the statement as well. So as you can see, 25% strongly agreed and 55% agreed. And another finding was that students were asked to say whether learning Italian allowed them to come closer to the Italo-Australian community. So here, it is not just about the speakers, as I said before, but it's more about the local community of Italians. And again, as you can see here, the majority of respondents agreed with the statement. This finding is becomes even more significant and considerable if we compare the results obtained for learners of Italian in Melbourne with learners of German in Melbourne. Learners of German in Melbourne is another learner population that I focused on for my PhD. And as you can see, again, learners of German were asked the same question, whether learning the language was a way for them to come closer to local communities in Melbourne. And as you can see, the vast majority for learners of German were not sure about the answer. So 43 learners out of 88 were not sure. So again, the differences in the findings can be explained in relation to the visibility of these communities in the context of learning. We know that the German community assimilated very quickly. German is, like Italian, a community language, but it has obviously a different status and a different visibility in the context of learning. Then I'm going to present some preliminary qualitative data from my study. I'm looking at integrativeness in particular. And as you can see, there were 79 respondents. As I said, 74 filled in the questionnaire with qualitative data as well. And then 5 were interviewed. So as you can see, 59 respondents, so around 74, 75 of the entire samples, mentioned integrativeness as a way, in the sense of learning Italian, to affiliate with the L2 country. And then 13 instead, so 16.5% of the respondents instead also mentioned the desire to learn Italian to come closer to the local community, also in the qualitative data. So as you can see, Italy, the desire to travel and to go to Italy is still the preliminary motivation for the majority of students, but local communities also play a role. And the majority of respondents, actually all the respondents that mentioned the desire to affiliate with local communities, also mentioned the desire to study the language, to travel and go to the L2 country. And these are some examples of how these two types of integrativeness go hand in hand. For example, learning Italian will help me speak the language more confidently in Italian-speaking country and within Italian communities. Again, this is reflective of the position of Italian in Melbourne. Or I will be able to converse in Italian in my community and overseas. So just some quotes from participants. Again, all the participants that I interviewed for my study acknowledge the presence of a local community in Melbourne. Julia, for example, says that there are a lot of Italian people in Melbourne, and Melbourne appears to her as a big Italian community. So it's again, it's an imagined community, but also a real community at the same time. And Helen instead makes a very, very interesting description of all the Italians, all the presence of Italy in Australia. So she talks about the people that are international students, the people that come to Australia to study, like me. And then there are also people in Lygon Street. Again, she mentioned that she might go to Lygon Street and find someone in a restaurant. So again, the idea, the association between Italians and food is very strong. And then she talks about older people. We were saying before that the Italian population is aging in Australia. So again, she associates also Italians with older people. So if she's in our environment with a lot of older people, there's a good chance that one of them would be Italian. She's obviously referring to the migrants that came in the post-war period. And then again, Jess talks about Lygon Street. Italians especially can be found in that area, obviously, as she says. And a very, very interesting observation is the one made by Emma, where she says that in Melbourne there are obviously more Italian speakers than in Perth, but there are not only Italian speakers, there are also Italian things, which again is linked to all the symbols and markers of Italianness that are disseminated in the city that I mentioned before. And other interesting quotes shed light on the inextricable link that there is between the presence of the language and the motivation for learning the language. For example, Emma is talking about the fact that she lives near Lygon Street and she's able to hear the language being spoken. And she says, I wish I knew exactly what they are saying because I can only understand bits and pieces. So this is coming from an Italian learner that she's given a reminder of why she is investing time and energy in learning the language. So this idea, the fact that she hears the language sort of gives her further motivation to continue studying it and to think of herself as a speaker of Italian that can understand what these people are saying in her community. And Jess instead are talking about an encounter with an Italian, again in Melbourne, and she says that this encounter was very important for her because it made her realize how much being able to speak another language is important. And she was able to interact with this Italian in his language, and she says that it gives her motivation, makes her feel what learning a language can do. And then another interesting theme that emerged from the analysis of the qualitative data is the access to material and symbolic resources that learners can do in the context of learning. So in Melbourne, again, Helen is saying that there's a whole range of resources in Melbourne that she's able to access by speaking Italian. And another very, very interesting aspect is that a lot of students talk about the benefits of speaking Italian for instrumentality reasons. We said before that Italians is not normally associated with instrumental benefits. It's mostly perceived as a cultural language. But a lot of learners are saying that instead learning Italian becomes relevant in the context of learning because it is a way to interact with the community, with the local community. So for example, Emma is saying that it would be useful, could be a useful tool to interact with Italian people. And Alice instead is talking about the fact that Italian is important as a way to engage with the community. And another questionnaire respondent is saying that she's a student of psychology and learning Italian gives her the skill to assist in the treatment of Italian immigrants. So for this group of learners, Italian becomes important also on an instrumental level to be able to engage with the community and on a personal or professional level. So I just wanted to finish off by talking about how we can capitalize on the linguistic potential of transcultural spaces like Melbourne. So what we have to do as teachers is that we have to raise students' awareness of the resources that are opened up by language proficiency in places like Melbourne. So we have to show students that they can access resources by speaking a community language. And the University of Melbourne, for example, states in the brochure that learning Italian is not only a way to understand Italy and the culture associated with Italy, but it's also a way to learn how Italy has influenced Australian food, art, and lifestyle. So this is something that is already recognized as an important learning outcomes. And another aspect that we have to, I want to draw your attention to is the fact that we have to show how Italian can be a way, learning Italian can be a way to engage with the community. And there are some projects that are already in place to link the learning of a community language with an engagement with the community. And two very interesting ones are the one that is described by Bouvet. It is a project called Language in Action that is it has been proposed by Flinders University, and it is a project that involves 30 students, and they can go, for example, to settings where the language is spoken, for example, aged care centers or cultural associations, and it is a way for students to use the language in the context of learning and understand how learning that particular language can help her engage with the community on a deeper level. And with regard to the Melbourne context, Wang and Cordella talk instead about the benefits of intergenerational encounters between young language learners and members, older migrants. And for example, for a project, she organized a series of meetings between conversation between young high school students and older migrants. They had to speak in the migrant language, and one of the findings of the study was that that was a good way for the students not only to improve their language skills, but also to acquire intercultural skills and also engage with the community on a deeper level. Thank you very much.